The wind howled at -50, snapping power lines like brittle twigs. In Bitterroot Valley, the wealthy huddled in dark, freezing mansions, their breath turning to fog indoors. Yet on a quiet slope just outside town, one woman sat comfortably in a t-shirt. Her secret wasn't money, fuel, or luck. It was dirt and the fact that no one had taken her seriously. Bryony Ashcroft didn't look like someone preparing for the end of the world. At 42, she was a former high school biology teacher who had inherited 3 acres of dry, scrubby land from her grandfather. When she arrived in early spring driving a battered 1998 Ford Ranger loaded with tools and stacks of empty burlap sacks, locals dismissed her instantly. Another outsider chasing some vague dream. But Bryony hadn't come to wander. She had come to build. Instead of pouring concrete or hiring contractors, she started digging. For weeks she lived out of her truck, carving a wide, curved trench into the side of a south-facing hill. Then she began filling sacks with earth, stacking them in layers, binding them with barbed wire. Slowly, a strange, rounded structure began to rise from the ground. At the Bluebird Diner, the talk turned sharp. "She's building herself a mud bunker," Brenda Walsh scoffed, watching Bryony through the window as she came in for coffee, hands stained with clay. Dave Harrison, the county building inspector, shook his head. "Not for long. Frost heave alone will destroy that thing. I'll shut it down tomorrow." But when Dave arrived at the site, ready to issue citations, he was caught off guard. The walls weren't crude, they were deliberate, thick, engineered. Bryony met him calmly and handed over a sealed binder. Inside were detailed architectural plans professionally drafted and stamped by Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a structural engineer known for designing earth-sheltered homes. "A stabilized rammed earth system," she explained evenly. 2-foot-thick walls for thermal mass, earth bags for structure, barbed wire for tensile strength. It complies with the state's alternative building code. Dave flipped through the pages. Soil tests, drainage plans, structural calculations, everything checked out. There was nothing he could do. He left, unsettled, convinced the valley's brutal winter would prove her wrong. Because no matter how neat the paperwork was, no one believed a house made of dirt could stand against the cold. No one except Bryony. By midsummer, Bryony's plot had become the valley's premier roadside attraction. The mockery wasn't just behind her back anymore, it was blatant. Leading the charge was Randall Henderson, a wealthy real estate developer from out of state, who had purchased the 20-acre lot directly adjacent to Bryony's. Randall was in the process of building his masterpiece, a sprawling, 6,000-square-foot modern mansion made almost entirely of steel, imported Italian stone, and floor-to-ceiling double-paned glass. It was a monument to wealth and modern technology, equipped with smart grid climate control, a heated driveway, and an automated backup generator. One sweltering July afternoon, Randall strolled over to Bryony's property line, wearing pristine golf clothes and holding a bottle of sparkling water. Bryony was thigh-deep in a mixing pit, stomping a mixture of clay, sand, water, and straw with her bare feet to create the cob that would plaster her walls. "You know, Bay," Randall called out, a condescending smirk plastered across his tanned face. "If you need a loan for some drywall, you just have to ask. I hate seeing my neighbors live like peasants from the Dark Ages." Bryony didn't stop stomping. "I appreciate the concern, Randall, but your glass house is going to bleed heat faster than a sieve in January. The thermal mass of these walls will store the sun's energy." "I won't need a furnace." Randall laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound that echoed across the valley. "Right, magic mud. Well, when you freeze to death, I'll make sure to tell the paramedics where to dig." A local teenager even started a social media page called the Bitterroot Mud Hut, posting weekly updates of Bryony's progress. They mocked the way the house looked like a giant, brown organic lump hugging the hillside, completely lacking the sharp, elegant lines of Randall's mansion. They mocked her sunken greenhouse built into the front of the structure. They mocked the strange cylindrical metal barrel she installed in the center of the living space, which she called a rocket mass heater. Through it all, Bryony remained silent. She didn't argue on the internet. She didn't defend herself at the diner. She just kept building. She applied thick layers of earthen plaster, smoothing it with her hands until the walls took on the texture of polished leather. She installed salvaged, heavy-duty insulated windows along the southern face to capture the low winter sun. She chopped cords of scavenged deadwood, stacking them meticulously against the northern berm. As October arrived and the golden aspen leaves began to fall, the house was finished. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but to Bryony it was perfect. The thick walls absorbed the daytime heat and slowly released it at night. It smelled faintly of dried grass and warm earth. Next door, Randall Henderson threw a lavish housewarming party. Music thumped through his expensive sound system, spilling out of his blowing glass palace. Bryony sat on her earthen bench, drinking a cup of chamomile tea, watching the artificial lights of his mansion glare against the dark mountain sky. The town had had its laugh, but the weather was about to change the punchline. November brought an unusual stillness to Bitterroot Valley. The autumn winds, usually fierce and unpredictable, died down completely, replaced by a heavy, leaden sky that seemed to press down on the mountaintops. Stan Yablonsky, the veteran local weatherman, looked visibly shaken during his 6 o'clock broadcast. Standing in front of a radar map that was swathed in deep, alarming shades of purple and black, he pointed a shaky finger at a massive swirling vortex dropping down from the Canadian north. "Folks, I've been doing this for 30 years, Stan said, his usual cheerful demeanor completely absent. I have never seen a model like this. We are looking at a historic atmospheric anomaly. A collapsed polar vortex is merging with a high-moisture Pacific front. The National Weather Service is calling it a generational freeze. We are looking at temperature plummets of 50 to 60 degrees within a matter of hours, accompanied by heavy, wet snow. If you do not have emergency heating supplies, get them now." In the Bluebird diner, Brenda Walsh turned the volume up on the television, frowning. "Generational freeze. Sounds like media hype to sell more bread and milk." "Exactly," agreed Pastor Greg Higgins, sipping his soup. "We live in Montana. We know how to handle the cold. My heat pump is brand new." Up on the hill, Randall Henderson was similarly unbothered. He sat in his leather recliner, tapping an app on his smartphone to adjust the ambient floor heating to a balmy 74 degrees. His smart home was directly connected to the valley's main electrical grid, and his backup generator was fueled by a 500-gallon propane tank. He felt invincible. He even posted a photo on his social media feed of himself holding a glass of bourbon, the dark, stormy sky visible through his massive glass windows. The caption read, "Let it snow. The smart house is ready." A few hundred yards away, Bryony Ashcroft wasn't looking at her phone. She was watching the wildlife. The deer had vanished. The birds were entirely silent, burrowed deep into the tree line. The barometric pressure was dropping so fast it made her ears pop. Bryony moved with quiet, calculated urgency. She went to her indoor sunken greenhouse and harvested the last of her vulnerable vegetables, moving them deeper into the core of the house. She checked the seals on her heavy, insulated doors. Finally, she loaded her rocket mass heater, a highly efficient wood stove designed to burn small sticks at incredibly high temperatures, forcing the exhaust through a massive cob bench that stored and radiated the heat for days. She struck a match, lit the kindling, and listened to the low jet engine-like roar of the fire drafting perfectly into the earthen mass. On Tuesday afternoon hiss, a single fathom, but would unravel his intly etched in. It was a high-pitched, shrieking howl as the Arctic front slammed into the valley. Within 20 minutes, the temperature outside plummeted from a mild 30 degrees down to -10. An hour later, it hit -25. The heavy, wet snow followed, driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds. It plastered against the sides of houses, instantly freezing into inches of solid ice. Inside his mansion, Randall Henderson woke up to a faint, rhythmic clicking sound. He threw off his silk sheets, shivering. The air in his bedroom was noticeably chilly. Frowning, he grabbed his phone and opened his smart home app. The screen flashed a red warning, grid voltage irregularity. The entire Bitterroot Valley electrical grid was fighting a losing battle. Thousands of modern heat pumps and electric furnaces kicked into overdrive simultaneously, desperately trying to combat the catastrophic temperature drop. The strain on the local substations was immense. Suddenly, a massive flash of blue light illuminated the valley through the storm, followed by a concussive boom that rattled windows for miles. The primary electrical substation on the edge of town had catastrophically failed, its transformers exploding under the unprecedented load. Instantly, the valley was plunged into pitch darkness. Randall wasn't worried. He waited for the familiar hum of his massive backup generator to kick in. 10 seconds passed, 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing happened. Panic fluttering in his chest, Randall grabbed a flashlight and ran down to his utility room, his bare feet recoiling from the suddenly freezing imported stone tiles. The ambient floor heating had died instantly. He reached the generator control panel and hit the manual override. The engine sputtered, cranked sluggishly, and died. He ran outside into the howling blizzard wearing only his pajamas to check the exterior intake. The wind knocked him off his feet, the -30-degree air burning his lungs like inhaled acid. He clawed his way to the generator housing. The heavy, wet snow that had preceded the deep freeze had driven directly into the generator's exhaust and intake vents, freezing solid in the sudden temperature plunge. The machine was choked with a block of concrete hard ice. Scrambling back inside, coughing violently, Randall realized his nightmare was just beginning. His home, a marvel of modern architecture, was fundamentally a giant glass box. Without the massive, constant influx of forced artificial heat, there was nothing to stop the cold from coming in. The immense panes of double-paned glass, lacking the thermal mass of traditional walls, began to bleed the internal heat into the roaring storm at an astonishing rate. The temperature inside the mansion began to drop by a degree every 4 minutes. Down in the town, chaos was unfolding. Dave Harrison, the building inspector, wrapped himself in 3 blankets, desperately trying to light a fire in a decorative fireplace that wasn't designed for actual heating. Water pipes in the walls of the town's lightweight timber-framed homes began to freeze and burst, sending cascades of water into living rooms, only for the water to freeze into slick, treacherous ice rinks minutes later. At -40 degrees, physics began to enact its brutal toll on Randall's glass palace. The massive temperature differential between the freezing exterior and the rapidly cooling interior, combined with the hurricane-force winds flexing the structural steel, created an unbearable tension. Crack. Randall jumped, shining his flashlight toward the living room. One of his massive 20-foot floor-to-ceiling windows had developed a spiderweb fracture right down the middle. As he watched in horror, the extreme thermal shock proved too much. With a sound like a shotgun blast, the giant pane of glass exploded inward, showering the imported rugs with razor-sharp shards. The wind shrieked into the living room, bringing the -40-degree air and swirling snow directly into the house. Randall screamed, the sound instantly swallowed by the storm, and bolted for the hallway, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind him to isolate the breach. He was trapped in the inner corridors of his own home, shivering violently, realizing with sheer terror that his smart home had become a death trap. Next door, Bryony Ashcroft was sound asleep. The mud brick and earth bag walls of her home, 2 feet thick and burned into the hillside, completely isolated her from the raging wind. The storm could not flex dirt. The cold could not quickly penetrate mass. The earthen bench running along her living room, heated by a single bundle of sticks burned hours ago, steadily radiated a deep, comforting warmth into the room. The internal temperature of Bryony's mud hut held steady at a comfortable 68 degrees. She woke up only once, disturbed by the faint sound of a muffled boom in the distance, the substation failing. She blinked in the dark, pulled her quilt up to her chin, and went peacefully back to sleep, completely unaware that the world outside had frozen over. But as dawn approached, bringing with it a temperature of negative 52 degrees, the true struggle for survival in Bitterroot Valley was only just beginning. And the town's biggest joke was about to become their only hope. By 6 a.m. on Wednesday, the temperature inside the inner hallway of Randall Henderson's mansion had plummeted to a lethal negative 8 degrees. He was huddled in the corner of his walk-in closet, wearing a cashmere overcoat, 3 designer sweaters, and wrapped in a decorative duvet that offered almost no insulation. His breath crystallized in the air, falling like tiny diamonds onto his lap. The violent shivering that had racked his body for the first 3 hours had terrifyingly begun to subside, a clinical sign that his core temperature was dropping below 90 degrees and severe hypothermia was setting in. His phone was a lifeless brick, its lithium-ion battery drained instantly by the extreme cold. The sprawling 6,000-square-foot architectural marvel he had built to dominate the landscape was now actively killing him. The shattered window in the living room had allowed the storm to completely equalize the indoor and outdoor temperatures. The steel framing, which he had proudly touted as industrial chic, was acting as a thermal bridge, violently sucking the last remaining ambient heat out of the structure and venting it into the negative 52-degree blizzard outside. Through the fog of his slowing mind, a primal instinct took over. Randall knew with absolute certainty that if he closed his eyes, he would never open them again. He forced himself to crawl out of the closet and stagger toward the frosted glass of his bedroom window. He rubbed a small circle clear with the heel of his numb hand and peered out into the howling whiteout. Through the churning snow, about 200 yards away, he saw it. It wasn't much, just a faint, thin ribbon of gray smoke, violently whipping away from a metal pipe, protruding from a snow-covered mound. But to Randall, it was a beacon. It was Bryony's chimney, the mud hut, the joke of Bitterroot Valley. She had fire, she had heat. Swallowing his pride, his arrogance, and his fear, Randall made the only decision left. He had to cross the property line. He layered on every piece of clothing he could physically move in, pulled a wool beanie over his ears, wrapped a silk scarf around his face, and shoved his feet into a pair of leather hiking boots. He walked to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed. The door didn't budge. The driving sleet that preceded the snow had frozen into a solid sheet of ice, welding the door to the frame. Panic spiked in Randall's chest. He backed up, lowered his shoulder, and threw his entire body weight against the heavy mahogany door. It cracked open with the sound of a gunshot, and the wind immediately violently ripped it out of his hands, throwing him onto the ice-slicked porch. The cold hit him like a physical blow. It was an agonizing, suffocating force that instantly froze the moisture in his eyes and nose. The wind roared at 60 miles per hour, creating a wind chill approaching negative 80. Randall pushed himself up and began to walk, 200 yards. That was it. 2 football fields. In normal conditions, a 2-minute stroll. Today, it was a death march. The snowdrifts were waist-deep and packed dense by the wind. Every step required a grueling, exhausting heave of his legs. Within 50 yards, he couldn't feel his toes. At 100 yards, the wind caught his cashmere coat, acting like a sail, and threw him face first into a drift. He scrambled to get up, but his muscles were stiffening, misfiring under the neurosuppressive effects of the extreme cold. He lost his right boot in the snowpack. When he pulled his foot out, covered only in a thin argyle sock, the frostbite began its work in seconds, turning the tissue white, then a pale, waxy yellow. "Help," he croaked, but the wind snatched the word from his lips before it even made a sound. He couldn't walk anymore. He dropped to his hands and knees and began to crawl. His mind started to play tricks on him. The freezing agony began to fade, replaced by a strange, dangerous warmth. The snow looked incredibly soft. "Maybe I'll just rest for a minute," his brain whispered. "Just close your eyes for 60 seconds. He stopped moving, laying his cheek against the ice. Then a smell cut through the sterile, biting air. It was faint, but unmistakable. Wood smoke. And coffee? The scent of roasting coffee beans triggered a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. Randall snapped his eyes open. He was 10 feet from Bryony's heavy, insulated wooden door. The house was barely visible, the earthen berm completely camouflaged by the snow, looking like just another hill. He dragged himself forward, leaving a faint trail of blood from his frozen foot on the ice. He reached the door, raised a fist that felt like a block of wood, and managed 2 weak, muffled knocks before his eyes rolled back and he collapsed into the snowbank. Inside, Bryony was sitting on a warm cob bench, sipping a fresh cup of percolator coffee. She had woken up at 5:30 a.m. to feed another bundle of dry willow branches into the rocket mass heater. The internal temperature of her home had dropped a mere 4 degrees overnight, settling at a comfortable 64. She paused, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. She had heard something. A thud. It didn't sound like the wind. Setting her mug down, she walked to the entryway. She opened the inner thermal door, then unlatched the heavy outer door, pushing against the snowdrift. A body tumbled inward, collapsing onto the natural stone floor of her mudroom. Bryony gasped. It was Randall. His skin was a horrifying, translucent blue-gray. His eyelashes were frozen together, and his breathing was so shallow his chest barely moved. "Randall," she shouted, grabbing him under the arms. He was dead weight, but the adrenaline gave her strength. She dragged him out of the freezing mudroom, slamming the heavy doors shut behind them, sealing the deadly storm outside once more. She pulled him directly into the living room, hoisting him up onto the heated earthen bench. The clay and sand mass, radiating a steady, deep 90 degrees from the fire roaring inside it, was the perfect surface for someone dying of hypothermia. Bryony moved with clinical precision. She stripped off his frozen, snow-caked outer layers. She wrapped him in thick wool blankets she had stored in her cedar chests, tucking them tight to trap the ambient heat of the room. She filled 2 rubber hot water bottles from the cast iron kettle sitting on top of the stove and placed them under his armpits and against his groin, the fastest ways to safely raise a core temperature without causing cardiac shock. For an hour, she sat beside him, watching his chest rise and fall, feeding the fire, and praying that the town's wealthiest, most arrogant man wouldn't die on her living room couch. It took 3 hours for Randall to regain consciousness. He woke up to the sensation of deep, penetrating heat soaking into his bones. It wasn't the sharp, dry heat of an electric furnace. It was a heavy, radiant warmth, like lying on a sun-baked rock in the middle of summer. He blinked his eyes open. The ceiling above him was made of exposed, raw timber beams, interlaced with intricately woven pine panels. The walls were soft, organic brown, curving gently without a single sharp corner. The room smelled of dried herbs, wood smoke, and life. He slowly turned his head. Bryony was sitting at a heavy oak table, calmly slicing a loaf of sourdough bread. The only sound in the room was the low jet engine hum of the rocket mass heater and the muffled, distant roar of the blizzard raging outside. "You're awake," Bryony said softly, not looking up from her bread. "Don't try to move too quickly. You have second-degree frostbite on 3 of your toes. I've applied a yarrow and calendula salve, but you're going to lose some tissue." Randall tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He coughed, a dry, racking sound. Bryony stood up, poured a mug of warm water with honey from a thermos, and brought it to him. He took it with shaking hands. My house," he rasped, his voice sounding like torn sandpaper. "Your house failed, Randall," Bryony said gently, sitting on the edge of the bench. "The grid is down. The substation blew around 2 a.m. Half the county is without power." Randall stared at her, the reality of his near-death experience crashing down on him. He looked around the warm, softly lit room. He realized there was no hum of a generator, no forced air vents, just dirt, wood, and fire. How is it so warm in here?" he asked, a tear slipping down his cheek. He wasn't crying from the physical pain. He was crying from the absolute humiliation of his own hubris. "Thermal mass," Bryony explained quietly. "These walls are 2 feet of packed earth. They absorbed the heat of the sun all summer and autumn. Now they're slowly giving it back. The earth doesn't care about the power grid, Randall. Physics doesn't break down when a transformer blows." Over the next 3 days, the storm held Bitterroot Valley in a deadly grip. The temperature never rose above -30. Bryony and Randall sat by the fire, listening to her battery-powered emergency weather radio. The broadcasts were grim. Emergency services were completely overwhelmed. The roads were impassable. Down in the valley, Dave Harrison, the building inspector who had tried to shut Bryony down, was huddled in the basement of the local high school with 50 other residents, shivering under gym mats. Brenda Walsh was trapped in her diner, surviving by burning the wooden dining chairs in a metal trash can to keep from freezing to death. In the mud hut, however, time seemed to stand still. They ate root vegetables from Bryony's indoor greenhouse and stews cooked on the flat top of the wood stove. Randall, unable to walk, spent his time watching Bryony. He watched her tend the fire, feed her sourdough starter, and calmly exist in perfect harmony with the brutal environment outside. He realized that true wealth wasn't a bank account or a smart grid interface. True wealth was resilience. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally stopped. The heavy clouds broke, revealing a blindingly bright, freezing blue sky. The temperature crept up to a balmy -5 degrees. The silence was broken by the rhythmic thumping sound of a National Guard search and rescue helicopter chopping through the thin mountain air. Bryony bundled Randall up in her blankets, helped him to his feet, and supported his weight as they slowly walked out of the heavy double doors into the blinding white light of the morning. The helicopter was hovering low over their properties, assessing the damage. The view was staggering. Randall's 6,000-square-foot glass mansion looked like a bombed-out ruin. Every single custom glass pane had shattered from the extreme thermal shock and structural flexing. The interior was completely buried in snowdrifts. The imported stone tiles were buckled and cracked from the freezing water pipes. It was a multi-million-dollar monument to human arrogance, completely destroyed by 3 days of weather. Right next to it, completely undamaged, sat Bryony's home. The only sign that the storm had even occurred was the fact that the snow on the roof had melted slightly from the gentle ambient heat of the structure, creating a perfect protective dome of ice. The helicopter touched down in the field, kicking up a cloud of powder. 2 medics rushed out with a stretcher. As they loaded Randall onto the gurney, he reached out and grabbed Bryony's arm, holding it tightly despite the pain in his frostbitten fingers. He looked at the woman he had relentlessly mocked, the woman who had dragged him from the brink of death. "I'm sorry," Randall whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I was a fool." "And you were a genius." Bryony smiled, a gentle, understanding expression. She patted his hand. "I'm not a genius, Randall. I just listened to the dirt." 6 months later, Bitterroot Valley was still rebuilding. The generational freeze had changed the town forever. But the biggest change wasn't the upgraded power grid or the new municipal snowplows. It was the new construction project happening on the edge of town, financed entirely by Randall Henderson. A team of locals, including Brenda Walsh and a very enthusiastic Dave Harrison, were knee-deep in mud, filling burlap sacks. They were building the valley's new emergency community center. And sitting in a lawn chair, wearing a sun hat and dictating the architectural plans with a clipboard in hand, was Bryony Ashcroft, teaching the town how to build a fortress out of earth. Did Bryony's brilliant survival strategy inspire you? Sometimes the oldest methods are the most powerful. If you loved this incredible story of resilience, defiance, and surviving against the odds, please hit that like button. Share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload.